It's Parshas Beshalach. So we look at the beginning of Parshas Beshalach, and I think, again, as I've mentioned in the past, in the experience. Sorry, apologies. The difficulty we have with a parsha that we are incredibly familiar with is the fact that we read through the beginning of the parsha, we tend to read it always in the same way that we've always read it. So the parsha begins, Vahi Beshalach Parah sends the people. Hashem doesn't take them in a certain direction that's quicker. Why? Lest the people have regrets when they see they return to Egypt. And the question here is incredibly straightforward. And it hits you in the face when you realize it. We've just spent the entire time talking about how the moment of redemption was all they were waiting for, all they were hoping for. The very first parsha, the beginning, the parsha that begins with this idea of the Bnei Yisrael leaving Mitzrayim has to open with those words, that they're going to change their minds, they're going to go back to Mitzrayim. It seems very, very surprising. The whole concern is they might see war and then they might turn around and go back to Mitzrayim. And I think just to bring this into perspective and to understand what I think we're really dealing with and what the real challenge of this whole parsha, something which really effectively encompasses everything about the parsha, is to understand it in a slightly more contemporary context. You know, everyone knows January the 1st, 1863 was the second year of the US Civil War, the Emancipation Proclamation, freedom for the slaves. But what people don't necessarily realize, and a lot of research has been done into this in recent years, there's a book by a man called Jim Davis called Sick from Freedom, that what really the challenges that people who have been slaves all their lives faced upon freedom were immense. There was one freed man whose name was Houston Holloway, and he said, "We did not know how to be free, and the white people did not know how to have a free person about them." People died in their millions. It was terrible. A quarter of the 4 million freed slaves, they think, died within a short period of time. And as Davis basically writes, he says that freedom always comes at a cost. Why is that relevant to here? Because if you look at Rashi carefully, that Rashi on that first pasuk, what does Rashi say? Pen yinochem, lest they change their mind, yachshvu machshava al sheyatzu, they think about the fact that they've left, v'yidnu leiv lo shuv, and they give heart to return. They decide to turn around and they decide to go back. What does Rashi mean? Fear of the future, fear of the unknown, fear of being free could lead them easily to retreat to what they know, the Mitzrayim that they are aware of, however bad it was, however difficult that situation was, however much they felt like there was time to move on and they wanted to leave. The reality is what they knew was Mitzrayim. However bad it was, that was what they knew. So the idea here is, the key question of this parsha, how did they face that challenge? How did they face the challenge? How did they deal with the challenge of freedom? How did they deal with the challenge of what it means to have choices in life? To have choices, to be able to embrace the limitless possibilities of what freedom can bring. So this evening, I'd like to share with you, in the time that we have, several perspectives from the parsha, ways that we can understand the dilemmas of what it meant to be free for the Bnei Yisrael, and perhaps some ideas and methods and ways in which they are able to cope with those challenges. I think the first key we have is in the second pasuk of the parsha, and it lies in that obscure word, vachamushim. Pasuk says, "Vayasev lekem esom derech hamidbar Yam Suf." Hashem takes them the way of the midbar, the way of the desert, by the Yam Suf. Vachamushim olu v'nei Yisrael me'eretz Mitzrayim. Now, vachamushim is a very obscure word, and Rashi famously gives two explanations. He says, "Vachamushim ein chamushim ela muzuyanim." They were armed. And he goes into effectively what is quite a difficult process of explaining why the Torah has to tell us this, because otherwise you're going to wonder, how on earth did they have weapons when they later came to fight? The Torah says they left Mitzrayim armed. And then Rashi says, another explanation, he says, Dova acher, chamushim echod mechamisha yotzu, v'arba chalokim meisu b'shloshis me'afela. there was 1/5 left, and 4/5 passed away during the 3 days of darkness. One of the great untold tragedies of the entire story of Yetzias Mitzrayim, of the Exodus, is the fact that 4/5, tragically, some in the Medrash even say a higher number, did not manage to leave. They did not leave, they did not merit to leave, and they passed away. They died during the 3 days of darkness. There is another explanation. If you look at the Targum Yonisum and Azil, those of you who have across Gedolos and follow, you can see this very clearly inside. The Targum tells us the following thing. The Targum says like this. He says, it's important to understand, by the way, when we learn the Targum, people think the Targum is simply a translation. The Targum is a commentary. The Targum is a pirush. When you learn the Targum, you understand that there is so much in there of explanation, of commentary, of interpretation, and you're talking about some of the earliest Meforshim that we have. Says the Targum Yonasan ben Uziel. Hashem turned them around, turned them away the way of the Yam Suf. And each one left with 5 children. Each person, each family left with 5 children. What does that mean? What does the Targum mean that they left with 5 children? We know that it would have been statistically impossible that they each had 5 children. Clearly they had, many of them must have had many more. I'm familiar with the Medrash, with the numbers, the sheer numbers, the birth rate in Mitzrayim was exceptionally high. What does it mean they left with 5 children? You look at the Targum Yerushalmi, another very early Targum. The Targum Yerushalmi says that they left mezoinin ba'ovoda tova. They left armed with good deeds. What does that mean? They left armed with good deeds. We know that good deeds they had. Well, what we refer to, as we spoke about this last week's share, the Dam Pesach and the Dam Milah, the idea that they left, those were the only 2 mitzvahs they had, Bris Milah and the Pesach. What does it mean they left armed with good deeds? Says the Be'er Yosef Salan, in an incredibly powerful insight. He says like this. He says that you put together all of these midrashim, you put together all of these ideas. He says, what happened when so many didn't make it out? Only 1/5 of the Jewish people left Mitzrayim. Only 1/5 of Bnei Yisrael. What happened to the other 4? What happened to the other 4/5? They passed away. But what about their children? What about the rest of their families? What was going on? And he says it can't be that they passed away, because they didn't do anything wrong. What happened to those children? Says the Be'er Yosef, the Bnei Yisrael in that generation, what they did was they took with them all of those children of the 4/5 who were left without parents, all those orphans, they carried them with them when they left Mitzrayim. He says what the Targum means when he says each one, each one with 5 children, he says it doesn't mean 5 children. It means each one made up together 5 families of children. They made up together 5 families of children. And he says that was an incredible act of chesed, of kindness. That was what the Targum Yerushalmi means. When Yerushalmi says that they left with good deeds, what were those good deeds that they left with? The good deeds were that they carried with them those children, those other children. They didn't say, I'm in it for myself. I'm in it only for my family. They looked around and they said, we have to do something for these children. And that's what the Torah means when it says v'chamushim. They left Mitzrayim in 5ths. They carried with them those other 4/5. That was the good deeds that they had. And he says, why does the Torah tell us this immediately at this point, as soon as they leave? He says, because there's one thing to do chesed. There's one thing to do kindness in a situation where it's easy to do chesed, it's easy to do kindness. And it is altogether a totally different thing to perform an act of chesed, to perform an act of kindness in a situation where you yourselves are under a difficult stress, in a difficult environment. He says the Torah wants to publicize here, to publicize with this, as tzidkas b'nei Yisrael, the righteous of the b'nei Yisrael, v'chastom, and their kindness, that they did this kindness with the rest of all those orphans who have been left behind, to bring joy to them, to adopt them into their own homes, into their own families, and specifically in a place and an environment where it was incredibly difficult to do so. He says that these were the good deeds that they were armed with. And he suggests, he quotes in the name of a Chacham Echad, a certain Chacham, he says, who says that this could be the deeper explanation in the Pasuk in Yirmiyahu. Yirmiyahu, it says, Zocharti loch chesed ne'urayich. I remember, the Novi says, I remember for you the kindness of your youth. The chesed ne'urayich, avas klolosayich. What was the kindness? What was that kindness? Lech tech acharai b'midbar be'eretz lo zerua. You came after me in the desert, be'eretz lo zerua. Not just that you followed me into the desert, but you followed me, you set out with an act of tremendous kindness. Even that pathway, that stepping out into the desert was laden with chesed. That was the chesed nurayich, that was the kindness of your youth. And it could be, perhaps, that another reason why it's mentioned specifically here is because it connects directly to this concern of pen yinochem ha'am, lest the people will go back to the default position, to what they're familiar with, lest the freed slaves, people who have never known freedom before, who have to face the challenge of choice in life instead of all choices being made before them, people who have to face the idea of what it means to live for others. How did they cope? How did they cope? The way they coped was they made themselves even more selfless. They coped by putting themselves out, even in an incredibly difficult situation, for others, to care for others, to be there for them, to be as selfless as possible. The gift of freedom, as we spoke about last week, the gift of freedom is to be selfless. That's the greatest thing that freedom gives. It gives a person the ability to make selfless choices in life. A slave can only make selfish choices, not through any fault of their own, simply because they have to in order to survive. Whereas a person who is a freed individual, there is no limit to the heights that they can soar to, simply because they have the freedom of choice, the freedom to be selfless. When we live for others, we are able to conquer even the natural tendency of a shavu mitzrayim, the fear of the unknown, the scare, what makes us afraid of not knowing what the future holds, lest they will see war. They will see war, their fear of seeing war, the fear that leads us to turn around and say, we have to go back. No, what can deal with it? Selflessness. If we put ourselves out for others, we go beyond ourselves. That's the first message. That's the message of the Chamushim B'nai Yisrael. But there is, of course, a deeper, I think, process here. There is a deeper aspect and a much more complex aspect to the challenges of freedom. Because a nation that have just been freed, and again, we must have to bear in mind here the timeline, right? We are talking about when we get to Kriyas Yamsuf, we get to the splitting of the sea, we are 7 days out of freedom, right? That's all it is, 7 days. The day before that first day, the day before Tesvav Nisan, they are entirely slaves. They are living a life of servitude. They've only been 7 days out of it. And it's logical that they are still dealing with intense inner turmoil as to how to come to terms with the suffering that they've experienced. How to develop a perspective on the past that enables them to both move on, yet somehow accept life itself, in some way come to some sort of peace of mind and acceptance. And for this, I think we have to look at the depth behind the Shira itself, behind the Shira Hayam. Now, there is a medrash. There is a lot of Mepharshim talk in great detail, obviously, about the first word Oz. I'm sure you've heard many different explanations in the Oz Yoshir Moshe. What is the Oz? What does that Oz mean? There is a medrash which says the following thing. One of the most famous midrashim about this word Oz Yoshir Moshe. Then Moshe will sing. The medrash says, Omar Moshe. Moshe said, "Ba'oz chotosi, I sinned with the word Oz. I did the wrong thing with the word Oz. Why? She'omarti, because I said, Umei Oz bossi el paroi, dedaber el paroi, from the time when you came to speak, when I came to speak to Paro, Heira lo'om hazeh. I said that everything's going bad. I said to Hashem, the end of Parsha Shmos, I said everything is terrible. Because I came, everything is so bad. He said that was the wrong thing. I should have had more bitachon. I should have had more faith. And therefore, says Moshe, I'm going to put that right now. How am I going to put that right? I'm going to use the word again of Oz. Oz Yoshir Moshe, then Moshe will sing. And the Beis Halevi asks us to try and understand the depth of this medrash. What is the connection? Why is it that Moshe is specifically digging out this particular one, what would seem a relatively small failing that he has. At the end of the day, at that moment, things looked awful for the Bnei Yisrael. It was supposed to be the great turnaround. He was supposed to march into Mitzrayim with Aaron, and they were going to lead them out of Mitzrayim. Instead, they don't even get straw anymore. Things are even worse. It's a terrible situation. And yet, he focuses on that and says, this is what I need to correct with the Shiur. What is going on here? Says the Beis Halevi like this. He says that there is a basic level of simcha that a person can experience from a situation of salvation, of Hatzalah, where they turn around to Hashem and they say thank you. The basic level is that they say, thank you, Hashem, for saving me. Thank you, Hashem, for taking me out of a difficult situation, for giving me life once more. But he says, the difficulty with that perspective alone is that effectively you haven't dealt with what went before. The person hasn't dealt in some way with the pain that led to the difficult situation. That hasn't been addressed in any way, shape, or form. He says a much deeper level of simcha is to somehow be able to sing shira, to sing a song of thanksgiving on anything and everything, to come to a degree of acceptance, not through the point of saying, I understand necessarily why something happened, but I understand that it was all part of Hashem's will in some way. That, he says, is inevitably a higher level of simcha. Of course, in the context of Yetzias Mitzrayim, they could turn around and they could say, "O Shiur Hashem ki ga'o ga'o." I sing to Hashem for He has proven to everyone, to the entire world, His greatness, His mightiness through Yetzias Mitzrayim. And then perhaps they could understand the shibud, the slavery itself. But the point of Moshe singing with the word Oz was to say that he was addressing the very point that had troubled and pained him so much when he was in Mitzrayim. To be able to come to a level of understanding, of an understanding that everything is part of Hashem's will, and critically, not to ignore the notion of suffering. Because if the notion of the pain and suffering that's been endured by the person who has been through the experience, or in this case, the entire nation, the idea of the very concept, the trauma, the deep trauma of slavery they've been through, to ignore that means effectively brushing it under the carpet and not addressing it, not in any sort of deeper, meaningful way. An incredibly difficult thing to do, but perhaps in some way essential to some process of healing. You know, that Clonimus Kalman Shapira, the Piachana Rebbe, who was effectively known as the Rebbe of Warsaw in the sense that he was an incredible leader during the Second World War. His story is so amazing and tragic at the same time. Of course, he died in 1943. He was murdered by the Nazis at Triniki concentration camp. If you look through, famously, his droshes were called Eish Kodesh, the holy fire, and those droshes were buried under his house, or under part of a house in the Warsaw Ghetto. They were later discovered as part of the Warsaw Ghetto archive, the Onyx, as it was known as the Onyx Shabbos archive. People who have analyzed his droshes, it was weekly droshes that he gave at Shalashudas to his Kehillah. They've identified that 43 out of 87 of those droshes that he gave, this Rebbe gave to his Kehillah, Pichena Rebbe, 43 out of 87 deal with suffering. And that's an astonishingly high number. You might have thought that the way he would give them some form of comfort would perhaps not even go there, not go down that route, not even talk about it, but no. He had to find some way to lift them up, some way to say, Oidcha ki anisoni, as David HaMelech says in Tehillim. I thank you, ki anisoni. I thank you for everything, even the things which I don't understand, which I find so difficult, the affliction, atili lishua, and you will be for me as a salvation. With that, this idea of the Beis Halevi, the idea that the Oz Yoshir Moshe is to directly try and not just sing Shira on the salvation, but somehow sing Shira, a song of emunah on everything that has transpired, can help us understand, I think, what is a central part of our davening. Now, if you look at a davening itself and the way the centrality that the Shiras Hayam, the song by the sea, has to our daily tefillah, you realize a number of things. Firstly, that it is really, really central. You understand that if you aside from the fact that we conclude Pesukei de Zimra with the Shira Sayom, but we also include the essence of the Shira, both in Shacharis, before Goal Yisrael, before the Amida. We directly refer to the Shira, and the structure, the central structure of the Brachas of Kriya Shema and Mariv, of course, also they refer to the bracha after the Shema, directly goes to the heart of the Shira. It goes straight to the Shira. But you notice one thing if you look carefully, and that is there are two psukim that are mentioned both in Shacharis and both in Mariv. Now again, I'm leaving aside the Shira that we say during Pesukei de Zimra. I'm talking about the psukim that we mentioned during the actual brachas of Kriya Shema. And you see there are two psukim mentioned. And one of them is entirely understandable. Hashem yimloch la'olam va'ed. Hashem will reign forever and ever. That makes sense. That really is the climax of the Shira. They proclaim together as one, Hashem yimloch la'olam va'ed. But why is it that we single out Mi Chomocha B'Olam Hashem? Why is it that pasuk that we single out? Mi Chomocha B'Olam Hashem, Mi Chomocha Nedor BaKodesh, which we normally translate as, who is like you among the heavenly powers, Hashem, who is like you, mighty in holiness. Why is that pasuk of all psukim specifically singled out? It must be that it contains within it the essence of what the Shira is, of what the Song by the Sea is. And that's why we refer to it, we say, we that's the pinnacle, if you like, of that bracha. The idea suggests of Shimon Schwab in his beautiful Pirush on Tefillah is like this. He says that there's a Gemara in Gittin which says as follows. Gemara in Gittin Daf Nun Vav says, Debei Rabbi Yishmael Tanu, the Shiur Rabbi Yishmael taught, Mi Chomocha B'Olam Hashem, who is like you amongst the mighty ones, Hashem. The Gemara says, read it, Mi Chomocha B'Ilmim Hashem, who is like you amongst those who are mute, the mutes. That's how the Gemara explains it. The Gemara picks up on the fact that the word Ilaim is written with 3 letters. It's missing a yud. It's written Aleph Lamed Mem. That word means mute. Mi chomocha bo'ilmim, says the Gemara, who is like you amongst those who are mute. Shomea elboin bonecho. You hear the suffering of your children, but you remain silent as if you were mute. It's a striking Gemara. Mi chomocha bo'ilmim, who is like you amongst the mute. What does it mean? Says Rav Schwab, he also quotes Rav Hirsch, develops this idea. He says that the muteness, the ilaim, it conveys the powerful forces of nature itself, the silence of nature, the muteness of nature. The forces of nature are silent to the torture of human beings. It doesn't matter how terrible, how horrific the suffering that's going on to human beings, the natural world remains mute. Rav Schwab, who was not a survivor, he came from this environment. He puts this in such striking language. He says, on the days when tens of thousands of our brethren were screaming in terror and pain, while being brutally and sadistically murdered in Auschwitz, the birds continued their chirping, the flowers still blossomed, and the sun still shone. Nature did not take notice of the indescribable torture and the screams of innocent people. The natural world remains mute and does not cry out when such outrages are committed. For a few years now, when I take groups of students, although we haven't been able to do so recently, of course, to visit Poland, I stand with them outside the gates of Birkenau and I quote a powerful section from Elie Wiesel's Pilgrimage to the Kingdom of Night, where he refers to this very, very point. The fact, he says, the beauty of the landscape around Birkenau is like a slap in the face. He says the low clouds, the dense forest, the solemnity of the scenery, the silence is peaceful, it's soothing. He says, how can it be surrounded by such beauty rather than the ugliness you would expect? That, according to the way the Gemara understands it, was how the Bnei Yisrael felt in Mitzrayim. They could understand that the natural world was silent, but they turned around to Hashem and they said, how can you be amongst the mutes? How can you, when it says Vanitzach, we cried out, how can you be silent? We cannot understand. We cannot understand anything. How is it possible that you can be silent? Says Rav Schwab, when they reach the Yam Suf, when they come out of the Yam Suf, when they sing Shira, it is not that they understand. They don't have any answers to the question of Mi Chomocha B'Olam Hashem, Mi Chomocha B'Ilmim Hashem, who is like you amongst the mute Hashem. They don't understand why it was that they had to suffer. That is beyond human comprehension. But the one thing, they had reached in a level of emunah, of faith, was in some way to accept, that it was some part of a divine plan, that they had no way of fathoming and understanding why they had suffered so much, why they had to be in slavery for so long. We cannot understand, they said. We have no answers. We will still say, Mi chomocha ba'olam Hashem. But at the same time, they carried on and they said, as a result, Nora sehilos osefela, the end of the Pasuk, they reached a level of emunah where they could say, we have no answers, but we have faith in you, but we keep our faith strong, despite the fact that we have no answers. We acknowledge the difficulty. Nora means fear. Nora sehilos, fearful of praise. There is a fear in praising God. In this context, there's a fear in praising Hashem. You are Nora sehilos, you are fearful of praise. It is an incredibly difficult thing to do for a person to, in some way, as the Gemara puts it in Brachos, to give a blessing to Hashem just the same as we give a blessing on the good, to give a blessing for the bad as well. That is an incredibly difficult thing to do. It is Nora, it is fearful, it is awesome. But in this way, what this line does is it summarizes the entire Shira. It summarizes why it was that this Shira, this song, as we refer to it also in our davening, is a Shira Chadosha. What is the newness of the song? It's new in the sense that it's the first song recorded in the Torah, but there's something more than that. The newness of this song is the level of clarity that they have in what it means to be a ma'amin. What it means to be a ma'amin, to be a believer, is not just to believe in the good times, but somehow to believe in the bad times. Somehow to believe through all the difficulties, through all the difficult experiences, through all the suffering, to somehow remain strong in faith. That is the hardest thing of all. That form of acceptance in some way and acknowledgement. The Shira Chadosha, the new song that they sung, and the reason why that pasuk Mi chomocha ba'olam Hashem becomes the centerpiece of our davening, is because it provided a means of teaching the Bnei Yisrael for generation after generation after generation what their attitude would have to be when they thank Hashem, when they praise Hashem, because that's the story of our history. If the story of our history was only made up of good times, then it would be a very different Jewish experience, but tragically it isn't. It tragically isn't. The Jewish story is persevering. The Jewish story is being able to say, with one hand, Mi chomocha ba'olam Hashem, and the other hand, No rasilos osefela. Mi chomocha ba'olam Hashem is something. Mi chomocha nedor b'kodesh. Mi chomocha ba'olam Hashem, mi chomocha nedor b'kodesh, No rasilos osefela. To be able to say those words, No rasilos, you are awesome, of praise. It is one of the most humbling things in life to meet survivors who have managed to retain their emunah. And many of us have had that privilege. When you meet a survivor who has retained their emunah, their faith, and it's often an emunah pshuta, a simple, straightforward faith. It is the faith of someone who says, Mi chomocha ba'olam Hashem. I don't understand. I don't understand the silence. I do not understand anything, but I do understand that my role is to always keep hold and keep strong in that faith. I was once at a very, very, very moving moment with a survivor who was telling their life story. And there was a large audience there. And at the end, someone put up their hand and said, how is it that you still believe? And the man looked at the person and said, it's what I am. It's who I am. This is what I am. I'm a Jew. That's what I do. And it was just so simple in its simplicity. And yes, we know, of course, it is impossible to judge anyone, and people are in incredibly difficult situations. Some survivors stay strong, some were not able, and that is because of the horrific suffering that they went through. But one thing we see from the Shira Hayom, coming back to our idea of what it means to be, what it means to achieve freedom. Freedom brings with it choices. It brings with it choices in life, the choices and the ability to achieve a level of selflessness. That's very, very hard, to make those right choices. The slave has all the decisions made for them. To choose to be selfless is immensely difficult, as the Bnei Yisrael did, v'chamushim Bnei Yisrael. But freedom also brings with it a necessity to develop some sort of perspective of coping in life. some sort of way, a manner of reflecting on the ups as well as the downs in life, of somehow seeing them as one whole, of keeping strong in our emunah. The reason why the Shira performs this role for us, the reason why it forms such a central plank in our davening, in our tefillah, is because it is the Bnei Yisrael's own process, their own reflection. They're going through that process in order to try and come out stronger in their emunah, which they do. And their legacy to us is hopefully to be able to carry on into that pathway of emunah, to keep us strong, both through the difficult times as well as the good times. I wish you all a very good Shabbos. Thank you all so much for joining. And have a very good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.